Okay, so thanks Rudolph, and I want to especially also thank Thomas, Nina, and Andrew for organizing this great conference. While it's of course a big bummer that we can't be together this weekend in Kant's hometown, it certainly is an honor for me to be invited to give a talk at a conference hosted by the Immanuel Kant Baltic Federal University. And as things in themselves, it turns out that we can't all be that far from one another or from Kaliningrad. Anyway, I'm going to talk today about the nature and domain of science. I come to Kant's philosophy of science as one mainly interested in Kant's epistemology. At some point in my research, it struck me that much light can be shed on Kant's conception of a priori knowledge by looking at its role in his discussions of natural science. I then started thinking that the light also shines in the other direction. In the following paper, I will first introduce very briefly some key background epistemological concepts, and then turn to a sketch of what I take to be Kant's conception of proper science, one which is based on a particular understanding of its explanatory aim. With this picture in hand, I will then argue for my key thesis, namely, that proper science does not require knowledge of metaphysical foundations, or put positively, where explanation in science ends, so does science itself. So first, some background epistemological concepts. Both in the Logic and in the first critique, Kant distinguishes rational from historical cognition. This distinction has to do with how one cognizes a claim. So for example, in the Logic, Kant uses the example of a sea captain who knows the rules of sea navigation only by consulting the tables drawn up by others. He's not in a position to offer any explanation for why they are the rules, and so his cognition is merely historical. Kant then mentions a lawyer who, if he knows jurisprudence merely historically, is ruined as a judge, and even more so, he says, as a legislator. In the critique, he offers the example of a student who has mere historical cognition of the Wolffian philosophy, and as a result is a plaster cast of a living human being. He can count everything off on his fingers, but he can't respond when criticisms are presented. What's the point? In all these cases, one knows the relevant rules, laws, or principles of a system, but does not know how they are grounded, how to defend them, or how to revise them if needed. The general picture is that historical cognition of a fact, historical cognition of a fact is cognition that something is the case. It is, as Kant says, cognitio ex datis, cognition from what is given. Rational cognition of the same fact is cognition why the fact is the case. It is cognitio ex principiis, cognition from principles of intelligibility. So now I want to turn to sufficient grounds of knowledge. It's another background concept I'm going to be working with. In the Logic and in the critique, Kant discusses the sufficiency of grounds as a requirement on knowledge in general, but one that takes different forms according to the type of cognition at issue. The grounds of empirical knowledge are acts of experience. Such grounds are evidential in our contemporary sense of the term. And the sufficiency of grounds in this case provides empirical, or what Kant says names assertoric certainty. Here I take Kant to be making the basic common sense point that one can have enough empirical evidence to warrant the certainty of a claim that something simply is the case, an assertoric claim, without any further awareness that it somehow must be the case. I'm certain, assertorically certain, that there's a tree in my yard, and this is based on empirical, or sometimes he says historical, sufficiency of evidence. In contrast, the grounds of rational knowledge are grasped through rational or a priori insight, Kant tells us. They involve acts of comprehension. Kant tells us further that the sufficiency of grounds in cases of rational or a priori knowledge provide us with rational or apodictic certainty in contrast to assertoric certainty. Many, perhaps most, commentators assume that this must mean that in the case of rational knowledge, the truth of the knowledge claim is guaranteed by its grounds of cognition. Kant does not say this. What he says is that in the case of rational knowledge, we have an added consciousness of necessity. Given the talk of comprehension and insight, and given Kant's emphasis on the difference between historical and rational cognition, namely that the latter is cognition of why something is the case, a natural interpretation of rational sufficiency of grounds is that of having sufficient explanatory grounds of some claim. Note the consciousness of necessity that arises in this case. If one cognizes something by grasping its sufficient explanatory grounds, then one cognizes the necessitation of the explanandum by the explanans. This is a version of the so-called from grounds notion of the a priori. I do not assume here that this is the only notion of rational a priori sufficiency of grounds at work in Kant, but I too do take it to be a primary one, and related to other notions of the a priori, like that of being based on pure forms of cognition. In any case, this notion of rational sufficiency of grounds fits quite well with all that Kant has to say in the logic. Okay, now there's one further point I want to make before going on to conception of science itself. And for this, I want to turn to a passage here in the logic. So it's on the screen here. Our cognitions can concern objects of experience, and the certainty concerning them can still both be empirical and rational at the same time, namely, insofar as we cognize an empirically certain proposition from principles a priori. One and the same claim can be known both empirically and rationally, or a priori. This claim would be known empirically insofar as we have sufficient evidential grounds from experience. It would be known rationally, or a priori, insofar as we have sufficient explanatory grounds as a result of some act of rational insight. And here's just a note that I'll treat rational and a priori as equivalent terms in the present context following Kant here. So why is all this important, all this background epistemological work? Because science in its ideal form for Kant is knowledge that is rational or a priori, and thus also apodictically certain, and yet still contains claims that are also supported by empirical evidence. Okay, I'm going to focus on Kant's analysis of science now, and in particular what he calls proper science in the metaphysical foundations of natural science. According to Kant, science is a whole or system of cognition organized according to principles. Systematic cognition is then divided into the historical and rational, depending on whether the connections between the cognitions of the system are empirical or rational. Historical doctrines aim to be descriptive and provide systematically organized descriptions of objects grounded in empirical observations. Taxonomies, for example, place concepts into a system according to empirical similarities, the empirical connections. Rational doctrines, in contrast, aim to be explanatory and thus to give systematic explanations of facts grounded in causal laws. Chemistry and physics are both examples of rational science since they aim to discuss causal laws. While both historical and rational doctrines are considered sciences by Kant insofar as they are systems of cognition, he does seem to think that a stricter use of the term applies to rational doctrines, and he refers to them as natural science. Kant then, in a key passage, makes his distinction between proper and improper science. Any whole of cognition that is systematic can, of course, we all know this passage, but it's important for the paper, so I'm going to read it. Any whole of cognition that is systematic can, for this reason, already be called science, and if the connection of cognition in this system is an interconnection of grounds and consequences, even rational science. If, however, the grounds or principles themselves are still in the end merely empirical, as in chemistry, for example, and the laws from which the given facts are explained through reason are mere laws of experience, then they carry with them no consciousness of their necessity. They are not apodictically certain. And thus the whole of cognition does not deserve the name of science in the strict sense. Okay. Now, based on this passage, we might articulate Kant's basic model of natural science in terms of a syllogism, where the major premise is a causal law, the minor premise is some given fact, and the conclusion some other given fact. Or in other words, we have a syllogism that looks like this. All events of type A cause events of type B. Event E1 of type A occurs, therefore event E2 of type B occurs. So just trying to put in a schematic form what's being said in that passage from the Metaphysical Foundations. Okay, what Kant is concerned to point out in this passage is that proper science requires that there be more than empirical cognition, which provides mere inductive support, of the major premise. A causal law is, to be sure, posited here already, for that's what rational science seeks, but its grounds are merely empirical. So the question is, and this is Kant's question, how can the major premise be transformed into a rationally or a priori cognized claim such that it introduces a consciousness of necessity unattainable by inductive means? Remember, a priori cognition on our reading from the logic is cognition that delivers explanatory grounds. Finally, Kant tells us on a page later in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations that mathematics is required for meeting this condition of a priori cognition in proper natural science, and that physics, unlike chemistry, has been able to do this. Okay. Given this understanding of the project of proper science, I will now sketch what I take to be a paradigmatic case of a priori cognition of a causal law that constitutes an explanation of that law and at the same time introduces a consciousness of necessity, or apodictic certainty. So to provide some textual basis for my example, I'm going to introduce here two quick passages, a little motivation here for the example. First, from a reflexion. Empirically, one can certainly discover rules, but not laws, as Kepler in comparison with Newton. For to the latter belongs necessity, and hence that they are cognized a priori. And then the second passage is from Kant's idea for universal history. Thus nature produced Kepler, who subjected in an unexpected way the eccentric paths of the planets to definite laws, and she produced Newton, who explained these laws by a universal cause. The example of a priori cognition suggested here by these texts illustrates in a nice historical way the kind of picture of science that Kant articulates in the Metaphysical Foundations. Based on his empirical observations of the planets, Kepler proposed his law of elliptical orbits. He posited it as a causal law that explains a fact given other facts, namely a planet's location given its prior positions relative to the sun. Kepler's planetary science is, however, not yet proper science in Kant's sense, since the causal law it posits is merely empirically grounded. Kepler does not yet offer an explanation of the positive causal law, and thus also does not introduce a consciousness of necessity regarding it. It's Newton who does this. He assumes Kepler's law as a hypothesis and then provides the explanation for why this law is true by demonstrating through geometrical proofs how Kepler's law follows from his more fundamental laws of motion. Now, importantly, this geometrical demonstration is not a mere logical deduction from Newton's fundamental laws to Kepler's laws. If it were, Kepler's law would be cognized a priori through a kind of logical analysis, and such analysis could not give us explanation of a causal law. It is only because mathematical proofs appeal to some third thing, in Kant's terms, namely intuition of Euclidean space, in proving lower laws from higher laws, that we are able to say that we have cognized two genuinely distinct levels of law, and thus also that the demonstrations are genuinely explanatory. In other words, it is the synthetic nature of a priori mathematical cognition that makes explanation possible. Hence, Kant's requirement of mathematics for proper science. As is well known, this example of a priori cognition is to be found in Newton's Principia. In Book 1 and Corollary 1 to Propositions 11 through 13, Newton demonstrates that the orbit of a body in a field of central force must move in a conic section. He then in Proposition 17 shows the conditions under which this conic section is an ellipse. So the a priori cognition required for proper science is, on my reading of Kant, found in natural science itself. Okay. So here's a sketch of the model of a priori cognition in proper science then. On this model, we begin with the positing of a lower causal law that is supported by empirical grounds. We then seek to explain it by showing how it follows from some more general causal laws together with the laws of Euclidean geometry. This results in what we might call a progressive explanatory argument that contains the higher causal laws, or explanans, as its premises, and the lower causal laws, the explananda, in the conclusion. The consciousness of necessity is the consciousness that one has obtained sufficient explanatory grounds of the explanandum, or in other words, that the explanandum is necessitated by the explanans. Now, in order to avoid possible misunderstandings in my view, I want to call brief attention to two other features of proper science. First, we already claimed above that science requires systematicity. What constitutes a sufficient threshold of systematicity, I will not try to address here. But we can say that providing merely a geometrical proof of a law from a proposed higher law is certainly not enough for proper science. Second, at no point can proper science dispense with the need for empirical evidence. There must be something connecting the idealized geometrical constructions and demonstrations to actuality. To use our example, not only does Kepler's law continue to have an important independent source of evidence in experience, but it is also perfectly acceptable for Newtonian principles themselves to have independent empirical support. Here I will briefly refer to a comment Kant makes in the Prolegomena, and to which we will return later, namely that experience is, quote, a witness that natural science, and here Kant's talking specifically about pure natural science, cannot fully renounce and dispense with. So here's Kant's picture of proper science, according to the view I'm laying out here. It aims at explanation, and this is what explanation looks like. There's no doubt more to say about this view, especially since it's one that hasn't gotten sufficient attention in the literature. In this context, I should mention the work of our colleague Hein van den Berg, whose reading is compatible with some but not all aspects of the picture I present. In the next section of the paper, I shall argue for the further thesis that the above count of explanation is all that Kant has in mind when he talks of proper science. Okay. So I'm going to turn now to some standard readings of Kant's proper science. Above, I present a picture of proper science that locates the features of a priori cognition and apodictic certainty in Newton's geometrical demonstration of lower causal laws from his fundamental laws of motion. There is a long and robust tradition in Kant scholarship that locates these features elsewhere. On this reading, Newton's laws themselves must be demonstrated a priori, and thus cognized with the consciousness of necessity, and this a priori cognition is to be accomplished by connecting Newtonian principles up with metaphysical foundations. What I will do now is present two possible ways of construing this metaphysical grounding and try to show that there are good reasons for doubting that either one of these ways represents Kant's actual view. Okay, so first, let's turn to the transcendental argument reading of the metaphysical foundations. Again, I'm just offering sketches here of these models. Here I have in mind the work of Eric Watkins, although Michael Friedman's view also makes use of this general transcendental structure. On Watkins' account, the grounding of Newtonian principles begins with premises about a certain conception of outer experience. Here I simply set aside complications concerning the differences between Kant's articulation of the mechanical laws and Newton's own articulations. Okay, so transcendental arguments are, of course, a priori arguments. And so this would give us a priori cognition of Newtonian principles. Now note that on this reading of transcendental arguments, Newtonian principles are shown to be necessary conditions of the kind of experience with which the argument begins. They make that experience possible. They constitute explanatory conditions. So we might say that the conception of experience that serves as our basic premise, experience of outer objects, say, is the explanandum, and the Newtonian principles constitute the explanans, that is necessary but not sufficient explanatory grounds. Following others like Karl Amrich's, whose work serves as a model for Watkins' reading, we could call this a regressive explanatory argument form. But if this is the required a priori cognition for science to be proper science, we get the following complete picture. The crucial thing to see here is that explanation that constitutes the argument for Newtonian principles is discontinuous with the explanation provided by the demonstration of lower causal laws. This transcendental argument does not provide a deeper sufficient explanation of the phenomena that natural science seeks to explain. So in terms of explanatory goals, they must be seen as entirely independent projects. Given this fact, one might think of the role of a priori cognition in this transcendental argument as supplying, in addition to explanatory conditions of experience, a kind of evidential certainty of those conditions, namely of Newtonian principles, that would in turn provide certainty to all the laws that can be demonstrated from them. So now we have a different way of understanding the grounding relation here. Is the role of the metaphysical foundations to provide apodictic certainty understood in terms of some guarantee of truth? The first point to note is that in no way can any kind of absolute certainty of a Cartesian sort be achieved here, since the premises from which the transcendental argument itself begins depend on some general claims about the objectivity of outer experience. And this requires the assumption that we in fact have some kind of an objective empirical cognition of such objects. So this relates to an earlier point that came up in Thomas's talk. Now, the claim could still be that such a transcendental argument is required by natural science in order to bring a very high level of certainty, even if not absolute certainty. But note that if this is the right view, proper science is achieved only when it contains nothing but a priori cognition all the way down. For if we have this kind of a priori proof of Newtonian principles, and thus all the causal laws that follow from them, then we have essentially dispensed with the need for all particular empirical supports. Is this the goal of proper science? Is there textual support for this reading? Well, here's a text that suggests the very opposite of this view, and this might also actually be the text that Thomas seemed to be, or may have referred to earlier in his talk. Pure mathematics and pure natural science would not have needed, for the purpose of their own security and certainty, that's Kant's emphasis there, a deduction of the sort that we have hitherto accomplished for them both. For the first is supported by its own evidence, and the second, though arising from pure sources of the understanding, is nonetheless supported from experience and thoroughgoing confirmation by it. Experience being a witness that natural science cannot fully renounce and dispense with, because as philosophy, despite all its certainty, it can never rival mathematics. Neither science had need of the aforementioned investigation for itself, but for another science, namely metaphysics. I don't see any reason to try to explain away what appears to be a clearly stated position here. So I return to my earlier claim that what is central to proper science is not evidential guarantee, some kind of near Cartesian certainty of its claims at all. Of course, proper science does need to be well-grounded evidentially, but the essential requirement of proper science on the hypothesis I'm pursuing here, and articulated by Kant in terms of a priori cognition and apodictic certainty, is the achievement of explanation of lower causal laws. Let me turn now to a second model for understanding the grounding project of the metaphysical foundations. So the second way of understanding the a priori grounding of natural science on metaphysical foundations is as a kind of logical deduction by simple substitution of terms, of Newtonian principles from transcendental principles. For example, where the term matter is substituted for the term substance in the principle of the first analogy. It's just an example. In general, I think there's good reason to doubt that this is the move Kant makes to transform natural science into proper science. For one, if it were, one would expect Kant to explicitly present and emphasize such deductions, but they aren't really to be found in Kant's text. But let's set this point aside and see how the model might work. As we have seen, there are two ways of understanding the main role of a priori cognition in natural science. Either it provides explanation of a targeted claim, or it provides some kind of evidential guarantee or near guarantee of the targeted claim. Let's take the latter case first, where deduction from transcendental principles is supposed to provide some high level of evidential certainty of the truth of Newtonian principles. Note this way of guaranteeing the truth of Newtonian principles depends on the evidential grounds of the transcendental principles. So if the logical deduction of Newtonian principles from transcendental principles is required for natural science to be proper science, then we would of course have to include in proper science the grounding of the transcendental principles themselves. The whole point of appealing to them is that they themselves are apodictically known. So now proper science looks like this. On this view, in order to have proper scientific knowledge, we need to have extensive knowledge of transcendental philosophy. Needless to say, this is quite an intellectually demanding view of natural science and its proper aim. Are there reasons to attribute it to Kant? Here I will simply refer back to the point I made above, that first, this view would imply that all specific empirical evidence for the causal laws of natural science is ultimately dispensable. And two, instead of finding textual evidence for such a reading, we find textual evidence that explicitly opposes it. So let me turn now to the other way of reading a priori cognition, namely as providing not evidential near certainty, but rather explanation of the targeted claim. On this view, the logical deduction model would look like this. If the logical deduction of Newtonian principles really did supply sufficient explanatory grounds of Newtonian principles, then on my reading of natural science above, this would count as an extension of the progressive explanatory structure of natural science. While it seems uncontroversial that transcendental principles are rightly understood as necessary conditions of Newtonian principles, it's hard to see that simple substitution of terms in the transcendental principles will somehow constitute a genuine explanation of Newtonian principles. Can logical grounds in general provide explanatory grounds of causal laws? For the sake of argument, let's say they do. But then the question is, why would Kant require this extra level of explanation in order for science to become proper? We already have a priori explanatory grounding at the level of Newtonian physics, and so adding this supposedly deeper level of sufficient explanation, if it can be construed this way, would change the degree of explanation the science has achieved, but not the kind of explanation. If the answer to this question is that tracing the explanation back to transcendental principles is a kind of a priori cognition that will give us a new kind of evidential certainty, then we're back to where we were in our prior discussion. Okay, my hope is to have at least tried to make clear what our options are, under the assumption that the a priori cognition required by proper science is to be found in the grounding of natural science on metaphysical foundations. I haven't shown that any of those readings of the a priori cognition requirement of proper science must be false. And I certainly haven't shown, and this is important, that these readings aren't accurate ways of interpreting arguments Kant gives to accomplish other tasks that Kant sets himself in the metaphysical foundations. What I have tried to show is that there seems inadequate philosophical or textual reason to hold the view that proper science requires cognition of its metaphysical foundations when one tries to be more precise about how these models would actually work. And this, especially given the fact that there is an alternative conception of proper science available that has both textual support and is, I think, much more philosophically plausible. Okay, the last thing I want to do is turn to an objection one might raise against the view I'm arguing for. Does Kant explicitly require of proper science both mathematical and metaphysical cognition? Doesn't this latter claim clearly support the view that Newtonian principles must be grounded on metaphysical foundations for science to be proper after all? Well, that, I think, depends on how we read key texts in the metaphysical foundations. So at 469 of the metaphysical foundations, Kant says this: all proper natural science therefore requires a pure part on which the apodictic certainty that reason seeks therein can be based. Then, after introducing the need for this pure part, Kant distinguishes between two different types of pure rational cognition, the metaphysical and the mathematical. Regarding metaphysical rational cognition, he says, properly so-called natural science presupposes, in the first place, metaphysics of nature. Kant then goes on to describe what he will do in the metaphysical foundations. Directly after this discussion, Kant turns in the next paragraph to mathematical rational cognition and says this: I assert, however, that in any special doctrine of nature, there can be only as much proper science as there is mathematics therein. Now, one might quickly conclude from all this that both mathematics and metaphysics are required for proper science as such. That is, that both are necessary constituents of proper and thus pure natural science. On this view, physics requires not only the kind of thing on display in Newton's mathematical explanations, but also Kant's metaphysical foundations. Now, I think this inference is false. The first point is that there is a difference between saying that something is presupposed and saying that something is contained therein. Second, Kant seems to signal a contrast between the two cases here. After he discusses the presupposed metaphysics and turns to the case of mathematics, he makes use of the expression however, aber. Again, he says, I assert, however, that in any special doctrine of nature there can be only as much proper science as there is mathematics therein. If a contrast is being made here, and I don't know how else to read the aber, then the difference between presupposing and containing would be an obvious candidate for the distinction being drawn. What could such a distinction amount to? So now I want to look to another case of knowledge that might help us think through this distinction. The science of Euclidean geometry can presumably be known a priori without any knowledge of the metaphysical conditions that make it possible. For example, that space is an a priori form of intuition. I take it that this is Kant's view. But it is nonetheless true, according to Kant, that Euclidean geometry presupposes this metaphysical view. This science could not be possible, Euclidean geometry now, could not be possible without a certain metaphysics concerning the nature of the thinking subject. But this does not mean that knowledge of the science of geometry cannot be had without knowledge of the metaphysics. It seems to me that it is in this way that Kant intends the point about proper science presupposing metaphysics. The a priori cognition contained in proper science, as I have described it, certainly presupposes certain metaphysical principles. But if I am right, proper science, that is the a priori knowledge of the propositions in Book 1 of Newton's Principia, for example, does not require knowledge of the deeper metaphysical principles that make that science possible. In general, this view of proper science is one that supports what I take to be Kant's general position that different domains of knowledge have different aims and methods, and thus different standards for what constitutes proper knowledge in those domains. I think it cuts against Kantian sensibilities on these matters to require of science that it becomes something else, namely metaphysics, in order for it to be properly science. And this is especially true when we have all the resources available, textual and conceptual, to show that there is a very sensible alternative. So in short, the thesis is that proper science is achieved through cognition of sufficient explanatory grounds of causal laws. Once it has achieved this, it has reached this new proper status. Of course, once science does reach the status of being proper, it can still advance. Nothing rules out the possibility of finding yet higher explanatory laws that can sufficiently explain the causal laws of the science with which we began. Such an explanation would extend the progressive explanatory structure of the science. As a final point, to say that proper science doesn't need metaphysics is not to say that reason doesn't need it. Reason has its own set of needs, and science is only one of them. I think this comes out nicely precisely where we would want it to in Kant's text, namely in the paragraph that introduces the pure part of natural science and the need for metaphysics. It follows directly after Kant's explanation of the failure of chemistry to provide a priori cognition of its merely empirically known laws. Okay, here's the last passage we'll be looking at. All proper natural science therefore requires a pure part on which the apodictic certainty that reason seeks therein can be based. And because this pure part is wholly different in regard to its principles from those that are merely empirical, it is also of the greatest utility to expound this part as far as possible in its entirety, separated and wholly unmixed with the other part. Indeed, in accordance with the nature of the case, it is an unavoidable duty with respect to method. This is necessary in order that one may precisely determine what reason can accomplish for itself and where its power begins to require the assistance of principles of experience. Here Kant appeals to the need, indeed the duty, of reason to expound its pure cognition in its entirety to see what reason can accomplish for itself. This is much like Kant's appeal in the first critique to reason's need for complete self-cognition. Note further that this project is introduced as a kind of additional task. Note the also underlined here. Those underlines, of course, are my emphases. Note further that this project is introduced as a kind of additional task, and Kant, moreover, feels compelled to tell us that it is of the greatest utility. If it were required for proper science, one wouldn't have to appeal to some other usefulness. Kant instead seems to be assuming a distinction between the scientific needs of reason and its philosophical ones. Philosophy might well aim at regressive explanations and systematic analyses of general features of experience. It might seek to secure the objectivity of or the unity among different domains of knowledge. And it might do all of this in the name of exhaustive self-knowledge. But science seeks something else, namely progressive a priori explanations of causal laws. And where those progressive explanations end, so does science, even if reason wants more. Thank you.